Okay, welcome to part 2 of me relearning Angular, and I called this series this because I've learned Angular in the past, but it's been a while and I just need a refresher, and it's my philosophy that practicing something never has its detriments. I think it's always a good idea, no matter how good you think you are at something. Not that I'm saying I'm any good at Angular, because that's really not the case, but no matter how good you think you are at something, it doesn't hurt to practice it, especially even the basics. And today we're going to continue on. As you can see, I didn't even post the first video in this series on here yet, but if you want to go check out the first video, we create an Angular project and we talk a little bit about the app component. We took all of the HTML that's in there by default out of there, and today we're going to talk about creating components, and hopefully you get something out of this. And if you do and you want to follow along, feel free to subscribe. I really would appreciate it. I do appreciate all of you guys that have been subscribing recently. It's been incredible, and we're getting closer and closer to 2,000 subs. I remember how long it took me to get to 1,000, and then getting to 2,000 is just like so much faster, and it's great. So without further ado, let's talk about components. So I have the project folder. I'm not actually in it, so let me cd to our project folder. It's called Relearn. And let me run the command. So ng serve -o, and -o, remember, is it opens the Angular app once it's done compiling. So while this is compiling, let's remind ourselves where we left off. The only thing we looked at in this app folder is the app component.html. And you can think of the app component HTML as the main component of this web app. But you can see there's other files here. So there's appcomponent.css, there's appcomponent.spec.typescript, so the .ts is a .typescript file, and appcomponent.ts, and also appmodule.ts. And so right off the bat, I'm actually going to delete this appcomponent spec.ts because this is going to be used for testing, and I'm not going to be using this kind of file or even test, really. With this. So why not just delete it, get rid of it, and that way it doesn't confuse us in the future. So move to recycle bin. And now let's take a closer look at appcomponent.ts. And here you can see a few things. We import component, the component decorator, from Angular core. And inside of this component decorator here, we have some metadata about this particular component. So one thing you might notice right off the bat, the selector is app root, and that might ring a bell from the last video, because if we go back to the index.html, we were wondering, what is this funny HTML tag, app root? But whenever we look inside that tag, it's what's in our component HTML. And that's how it knows that app root is linked to this specific component. So the selector is what tag do you use in the HTML to display or place this particular component. The template URL is pointing to the appropriate HTML document here. So the appcomponent.html is where the template is for this component. And then the styling is held in the CSS file. And then also inside of the appcomponent.typescript, we have a class where we can run some logic, make some properties like here, title is equal to relearn, and stuff that will look closer at in the future. Pretty much what I want you to take away from this, us looking at this together, is what's in this metadata, right? We have the tag that's going to be used to place this component somewhere. We have the markup, so the HTML file, which it tells it where is the HTML file for this component. It's right here. And where's the CSS file for this component? It's also right here. And this might still be confusing. It definitely was for me. Don't worry. What I want to do is I'm going to start a new terminal. So we're going to have one terminal that's going to serve this up. I'm going to start a new terminal here. And let's also cd to relearn. And now we're just going to create a new component. And I'm just going to make this a test component. I'm not sure if I'm going to keep this long term or not. I just want to show you how we can create our own component. And maybe once you create your own, it'll make more sense when we fill out the different metadata and such. So I'm inside our project, right? We're inside Relearn, and I'm going to run the command ng generate component. And if that seems like a lot to type out to generate a component, it is. And then we give it some kind of name after that. But there's actually a shortcut. You can do ng G for generate space C for component, and then give it some kind of name. So it's arbitrary. I'm just going to name it test and hit enter, and it'll go ahead and create this component. We'll see everything that gets created for this component, and hopefully that will clarify a few things. So we can see we get this new folder here now called test. So it creates a directory with the same name as the component. And then if we expand this, we see a CSS file, HTML file, the spec.typescript. So right off the bat, I'm going to delete that because once again, that's for testing, which I'm not planning on using. And then the most important piece that holds all of this component together is this test.component.ts. And this is the naming convention. It usually goes the name of the component dot explicitly component, just I guess for you to know that this is part of a component, and then .ts for TypeScript. And you can see it actually it added a bunch of stuff for us by default just by creating it with the Angular CLI. So it gave it a selector already. We didn't have to write this our own. It's named app space test. And then it also linked the HTML file it created for us and the CSS file that it created for us automatically. And then inside we have some stuff in the class that we'll touch upon probably in the next video. I don't want to jam pack this video with too much all at once. And really, my goal here is to just get you a little bit more use to components. So in the HTML, it actually put a little bit of stuff in this too. It says test works. Let's replace this with this is me creating, oops, misspelled creating my own component. And I'll save that. But if we look at the app, right, we still have it running. That component's nowhere to be found. And the reason for that is we never put the components tag anywhere in the app component HTML. So it has nowhere for it to know, oh, I'm going to place this component here. So our new component, I'm going to grab its selector, so it's app test. We're going back to the app component HTML. And below all of this stuff, I'm going to make a new tag, and the tag is going to be app test. And just remember what this is doing. All this is doing is it's placing the contents of this component and it's slapping it right here. It's pretty much replacing this tag with this HTML. So now if I go ahead and save, and we were to go to our other terminal here, it recompiled. And if we look at this, here's now our new component that we just created. And you can play around with this. You can change up the HTML. I highly advise you to do so just so you can get used to seeing how all of these things are connected. But notice something. If I go back to our component that we created, it's TypeScript, and I go into the component decorator and I change the selector now to, it's also arbitrary. I can name it just test instead of app test, and I go to save. Notice that it throws an error down here and it says in the app component HTML, it's expecting a component with the selector app test, but it's no longer there. And it's freaking out because it can't find any component with that selector. So now we have to go back to the app component and change these tags to just test. Now if I save, it'll recompile successfully. We'll look at it and the component is back. And something else I wanted to show you, just in case you ever see it, I don't particularly, this is my own opinion, I don't advise you to do this. I always advise you to have your own separate HTML document, but I'm going to comment out in this metadata here, it's template URL. And instead of template URL, let's just add another property called template. And all this is a string of HTML. So I'm going to put an H2 in here and say testing, exclamation point, and then the end of the H2, and then a comma. And if we go ahead and save this, it'll recompile, and let's look at the app, and now it says testing. So you can put your HTML in a string and use template instead of template URL, but I personally would always put the HTML in its own HTML document. One, because this doesn't have any kind of ability to make sure that your syntax is correct. And if I use my own HTML doc, especially in something like VS Code, it will check my syntax and make sure everything's good. This will just say, I'm going to use this whole string. I don't know if it's correct or not. We're going to try it out. And then if it's not, it'll most likely error on you. But I just wanted to show you that in case you ever see it in the future and you're like, what the heck? Why don't they have their own HTML document and they just have the HTML in a string right here? So the more you know. And then one last thing I want to mention, this is the app module. So this is, it was described to me when I started learning Angular as almost like a project file. It holds all of the different things that a project has so the compiler can go through and know where everything is and know how everything's declared. So every time a component is created in the command line, it adds it to this declarations in the ng module decorator. And notice we didn't have to put this in here either. It did it on its own. I never came in here and added it to this array. It automatically did that and also brought it in and imported it when it was created. But if we look at this, a few things you might notice. This was the first app component. This is the test component. And then any other components you create will also need to be in here for the compiler to know about it. And then also down here we see Bootstrap. And this is telling the compiler what's the main component for this application. So what's the parent component? In our case, it's going to be by default the app component. So I know that was a lot thrown at you, and don't worry, we'll talk about it again. We'll reiterate things as we go along. But really, if you are following along, and please do try this out on your own, especially if this is all new to you. Just create a component, change up the HTML, save it, watch it recompile, see how that displays in the app after it recompiles, and then try to break it. Go back to the TypeScript part of it, look at the selector, and change the text property of the selector here, make it something else, try to save it, watch it error out, and then fix it by going to the app component and appropriately, naming the tag or changing the text of the tag. In the next video, we'll talk about binding data. So how do I go from a property in this class and bind it to the HTML of the component? So stay tuned for that. Hopefully you guys are enjoying this, and hopefully, more importantly, you're taking something away from this that helps you. And if so, yeah, like I said, feel free to subscribe if you haven't already, and I hope to see you in the next one.